This module introduces many of the themes that will be repeated throughout the entire course. Given the complexity of the human body, it can be overwhelming to consider every single detail independently. The goal for this unit is to help you to recognize some of the overarching patterns that you'll be seeing over and over again within each system. If you can do this, then you'll find that it's easier to memorize the exceptions to the rule rather than to keep memorizing the same rules over and over and over again. So our goal is to introduce the disciplines of anatomy and physiology. We'll talk about structure-function relationships, review anatomical terminology, introduce the concept of homeostasis, and finally, we'll talk about compartmentalization inside the body. Many of the themes that you'll see repeated throughout the entire course are defined here on this slide. In each system, we'll talk about homeostatic mechanisms that help to maintain relatively constant internal conditions. We'll also talk about the reason why you had to eat breakfast this morning, or the ways that cells produce and consume energy, referring to ATP, the energetic currency of the cell. You'll see that the reason that you're taking a combined anatomy and physiology course is because of the close relationship between structure and function that's evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. And hopefully, by the end of this semester, I can convince you that it would be extremely redundant to try to separate those two disciplines from each other. Lastly, we'll talk about the ways that different parts of the body communicate with each other, mostly focusing on the nervous system and the endocrine system. So let's dig in. Anatomy is the study of biological structure. So for example, in this picture, we're looking at the tiniest blood vessel inside of your body, known as a capillary. The walls of this extremely thin tube are made from a specialized type of cell called endothelium. A little bit later in the course, we'll actually classify this even further as a simple squamous tissue, which will tell us that it's very thin and very flat. If you look closely, you can even see the red blood cells inside of this capillary, which you might notice have their own unique shape. Now, anatomy doesn't just have to refer to cells and tissues. In fact, we could study anatomy at many levels, and in many cases we will. For example, we could think about the anatomy of body systems, like the digestive system, and the organs that make it up, like the stomach. Or we could think about the tissues that make up those organs, like the endothelium that we've just talked about, or the cells that make up those tissues, or even the anatomical structure of the molecules inside of those cells that allow them to transport nutrients. So there are a lot of levels. And that means that the term anatomy is really an umbrella term. There are very, very few people alive today who would describe themselves simply as an anatomist. But most often, when people study anatomy, they're interested in a very specific subdiscipline. So, for example, a cytologist would study the anatomy of cells, a histologist would study the anatomy of tissues, embryologists study the anatomy of developing embryos, and neuroanatomists are interested specifically in the anatomy of the nervous system. But coming into this course, most people associate the term anatomy with gross anatomy, which refers only to structures that can be seen without the help of a microscope. The images that you're seeing here representing gross anatomy were taken from the Bodies Revealed exhibit, which is a traveling anatomy exhibit that really highlights the complexity of our bodies. Although there's been some controversy regarding the origins of the cadavers on display, it really is an amazing exhibit. If you ever get a chance to see it, I would recommend it. It comes every so often to the Science Museum in Hartford. But of course, most of our bodies can't be seen without the help of a microscope. And so a lot of what we talk about in this course is microscopic. This gives us the ability to study the structure of tissues, like for example, your intestine, which is pictured here on the left-hand side. The cells in the middle image have been labeled with fluorescent dyes so that we can see structures like the nuclei in blue and the components of the cytoskeleton in red. And we can even look at subcellular structures like the mitochondria on the right-hand image at a really high resolution. That's taken with an electron micrograph. So all of this is to say that you've actually picked a really cool time to be alive and to be studying anatomy. But anatomy is a really old scientific discipline. So in the event that you took anatomy in a past life with Leonardo da Vinci during the Renaissance, a lot of what you had learned then would still be relevant today. Those old Victorian drawings are still surprisingly accurate. And that's because human evolution doesn't occur at a fast enough rate for us to be too different than we were 1,000 years ago. But this doesn't mean that anatomy isn't a fast-moving field, because it is. But the thing is that the pace doesn't come from changes in our bodies, it comes from advances in technology, because every day we're figuring out new ways to understand ourselves in greater detail. So if you had taken anatomy with Leonardo da Vinci, you would have focused mostly on gross anatomy, because you didn't need a microscope. And if you had taken it in the early 20th century, you would have focused a lot more on histology instead. In the middle of the 20th century, the electron microscope allowed us to begin to see even subcellular structures. And now, in the 21st century, we're figuring out ways to look at the structure of individual molecules, like you're seeing on the right-hand side here. So I guess the goal of anatomy is really to try to figure out how all of this stuff, all these different components, fit together. In other words, we need to understand all of our parts before we can start to think of ourselves in 3 dimensions. So this picture represents a relatively new anatomical field called connectomics, which explores connections between neurons in the nervous system. But connectomics is only possible because we have the ability to see where individual neurons are located within our body.